About 9 months ago, my partner and I had just bought a 6-month-old boxer to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company. We decided it would be a good idea to take them for a walk in the countryside. We live close to a large city called Hull in northeast England, and chose to walk in a rural area north of the River Humber, which flows to the sea. We arrived at a village near a local landmark, a World War II Army fort, and decided to walk nearby through small patches of forest close to the nature reserve. We walked along a grass-covered bunker toward the forest, and suddenly my partner pointed out that 2 young men had started walking up the bank from the woods in a diagonal manner, as if they were trying to cut us off. At first, I wondered if they were attending some sort of World War reenactment, since both were wearing camouflaged pants and were covered in dust and dirt. I didn't think much of it, assuming they would just pass us by, but as they got closer, it became clear they were heading straight toward us. When they were about 10 feet away, one of them spoke up. The way he spoke still bothers me to this day. It was as if he had no regard for manners or even trying to make sense. He asked where we were planning to walk, and we told him we weren't really sure and would just see where we ended up. The young man looked disappointed by this and suggested that we take his route, which led through the forest to what he described as a great spot for sightseeing, with benches to sit down. While he was talking, the other boy kept a constant eye on our dogs, as if he wanted to make sure they were always in his sight. Since we didn't know much about the area and hadn't seen any other dog walkers, we took his advice and headed towards the opening they pointed out in the woods. The woods blocked out about 30% of the sunlight, and when I looked back, I saw that the young men hadn't walked off. They were standing there, watching us enter the forest. The path we followed seemed man-made, as it appeared to be the only walkable area in the forest. About 2 minutes into the walk, our Labrador began sniffing behind a bramble bush. At first, we didn't think much of it, as both dogs tend to sniff everywhere during walks. But then she started sniffing in one spot and rolling on the ground. When we went over to check, we found her sniffing a shattered rubber pig mask with a brown-red liquid on it. It looked disgusting, and my partner quickly pulled the dog away as flies were swarming around it. As we continued the walk, the woods narrowed into a long path of trees and bushes. We could see a turn far ahead and agreed that if it didn't lead anywhere, we'd head back. I walked ahead and was on my phone, preparing to take a photo of the woods, when I suddenly felt several small pricks on my neck, chin, and part of my face. I gasped to alert my partner, and he told me to stand still, alarmed, before carefully removing thin pieces of string from my face. It turns out someone had tied fishing hooks on lines to a tree across the walkway. Needless to say, we were both terrified, confused, and angry at this point. We hurried back to the car and drove home. I don't want to sound cliché, but as we drove off, I swear I saw someone peeking out onto the road through the rearview mirror. I can't say for sure whether the people we talked to were responsible for setting up the fish hooks, but it would make sense. I'm a guy, and about 11 years ago when I was 8 years old, my family, mom, dad, brother, and my brother's girlfriend, who was living with us at the time, went on holiday to Australia to visit relatives on my mum's side of the family. They lived in the rural parts of Victoria, and to give a basic summary, they lived on a farm surrounded by various fields. When facing the house, on the left side, there were 2 fields, and at the far end of these fields was a heavily wooded area with a dirt track running through it. My grandparents, who lived there, would often go on nature rambles through the forest to spot the wildlife. My mother, a dedicated bird spotter, decided to head off with me and Lisa, my brother's girlfriend, into the forest, as we both had a fascination with wildlife. We had been walking along the dirt track for about 10 minutes, taking pictures of the various animals we'd seen. We passed by a group of motorbikes and around 7 bikers having a barbecue. One of the bikers politely smiled at my mother, and she responded with a simple, "Good evening." As we walked past them, One of the bikers approached us and asked where we were going. We told him, and he informed us they had been camping in the area for about 2 nights. He warned us to be careful, as some people had been shooting game in the forest, and these people apparently had aggressive dogs, so we should be cautious. About 15 minutes later, I spotted an old barn and dashed off to explore it, being the adventurous child I was, while my mother and Lisa observed a bird. I didn't tell them where I was going. As I approached the barn, I saw 3 large dogs tied up outside. They were Rottweilers, and they seemed incredibly aggressive, barking and snarling a lot. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed they were for hunting, although looking back, Rottweilers aren't hunting dogs. There was also an old mattress on the ground outside, covered in brown stains and emanating a foul smell. I was about 3 feet away from it, but the stench was unbelievably strong. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a man emerging from the barn. The image of this man is one of the few things I remember clearly from that day. He was very tall, about 6'4", wearing a blue pinstriped suit. The strangest thing about him was the large top hat he wore. His clothes looked worn, and his face, the parts not covered by a large brown beard, was red, as if he had been working out on a hot day. I remember he smiled and approached me. I asked him if he was a magician, to which he replied, "No, I look after doggies. Do you like doggies?" I told him I did. This is when things started to get weird. He began to approach me and asked if I wanted to come inside and have my picture taken with the dogs. I politely refused, saying my mum would be looking for me. He lightly grabbed my hand and insisted it would only take a second. At that moment, I heard my mum shouting at the man, demanding to know what he was doing. She had come looking for me. The man let go of my hand and just stared at her blankly. She asked him again, but he continued to stare, not saying a word. My mum immediately grabbed my arm, and we quickly walked back to the entrance with Lisa. We were about halfway back when I turned and told my mother that the magician was following us. She turned around, and sure enough, he was power walking behind us. My mum screamed at him, asking what he wanted, but again, he didn't reply. He just kept coming. At this point, my mum began walking even faster, practically dragging me along. The next part is mostly a blur to me. I remember my mum gasping, picking me up, and sprinting full speed while screaming for help. My mum later told me that the man had started running toward us and had managed to grab my leg. She said that Lisa jumped on his back and scratched his face, but he threw her off. My mum kicked the man in the groin, grabbed Lisa, and continued running with me over her shoulder. We slowed down shortly after, trying to catch our breath. But then, the magician reappeared from the bushes. My mum started panicking again and ran with me as the man sprinted after us. We were nearing the area where the bikers were camping, and my mum screamed for help. 2 bikers emerged from the trees, and she yelled, "That man tried to kidnap my son." The magician immediately bolted in the other direction. One of the bikers chased after him, but unfortunately, the man had a head start and got away. The bikers were incredibly kind. I soon forgot about the strange man after one of them let me sit up front on his motorbike, while my mum and Lisa rode in the sidecar. The biker took us to the nearest town and dropped us off at the police station, where my mum filed a report. After that, he gave us a lift back home. I never got the chance to thank him at the time, as I didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. A few months ago, I was out hiking with my friend. We live in the mountains of western Maryland, and we were about 6 miles into an 8-mile loop we've done frequently when we decided to take some pictures and eat a snack at a summit. This area of the trail had a park, benches, tables, and a parking lot. While sitting and talking, I noticed a man walking around the parking lot alone. He was walking aimlessly and staring at his feet. What confused me was that he was in jeans and a button-down shirt, not exactly hiking attire. We decided to set off on the last 2-mile leg of the loop. This part goes downhill to the headquarters of the park and is cut out of the mountain. The end of that leg is the parking lot where our car is. You don't have a lot of visibility from the trail, and you have to walk single file. I was walking in front and talking to my friend when I turned to look at her and saw the same man right behind her, following at an uncomfortably close distance. I immediately got a gut-wrenching feeling. I noticed that he didn't have any pack or hiking gear and wasn't even wearing boots. Something about his eyes really spooked me. After walking a bit more, he continued to follow very closely. I told my friend that I needed to tie my shoe as an excuse to step off the trail and let him pass us, in case he was only following closely because he wanted to go faster than we were. She immediately caught on to what I was doing, and we pulled over. He looked startled, and she said hello politely. He just stared at her. That's when I noticed he was carrying a stick. As I pretended to tie my shoe, she stood between us, and he passed us. We waited to give him some distance ahead of us, but he immediately slowed down. We waited a bit longer, and when he got to the furthest part of the trail where he still had sight of us, he turned around and looked up at us. We decided something felt very wrong about this guy, and we didn't want to have to pass him again. So we turned around and walked back up the trail toward the park with the tables and parking. After a few minutes of walking, I looked back and saw him walking up the trail, following us again. I told my friend to walk faster. We booked it up the trail and got to the parking lot area where we had been before. We started to strategize, deciding to wait and see if he would come back up the trail to the lot. There were more people around, so we felt safer waiting there. About 20 minutes went by, and nothing. We discussed whether that meant he had kept going on the trail, or if he was waiting in a more deserted part of the trail. Soon, we saw a couple come up from the trail we had been on, presumably taking the loop in the opposite direction from us. We approached them and asked if they had seen anyone on the trail between this lot and the next. They told us they saw a young man sitting on a rock about halfway down. They described the man who had been following us. We explained our interaction with him to the wife, and we had a back-and-forth conversation about whether or not he was a threat. Finally, the husband interjected and said, "We need to call a ranger. He wasn't just sitting there. He had a knife and was carving that stick." Needless to say, we called a ranger. The nice couple walked the last leg with us to make sure we got to our car safely, and even gave us their numbers in case we needed anything. The rangers then walked the trail, but there was no sign of him. I wish I knew where he went and what happened to him, but I'm glad to know that my instincts were legitimate. A few months back, my girlfriend and I were bored, hanging around the house, and spontaneously decided to go out for a hike. We don't hike often, but the idea appealed to both of us. Even though there was only about an hour of daylight left, we figured we had enough time to enjoy a quick hike before it got too dark. We quickly filled up our water bottles, put on the best walking shoes we had, and were out the door, driving up into the mountains. Around my area, there are many hiking trails, with a greater variety as you go farther into the mountains. We usually stuck to the base of the mountains, where most people hiked, but we wanted to change things up, so we headed farther up the mountain road to a trail a friend had mentioned. We kept an eye on the time and figured we could hike for a bit, enjoy the new environment, and finish up before it got too late. We arrived at the trailhead and noticed there were no cars left along the road where the trail begins, but we didn't think much of it due to the time. We still had a good 45 minutes until dark, so we continued on. We started walking down a fairly steep hill, which regained elevation with an equally steep hill on the other side. We reached the top, and from there, it was smooth sailing. We saw a lone coyote off the trail and some rabbits, and I made a quip about how those rabbits might need to be careful with the coyote lurking around. She playfully hit me for that one. About a mile into the trail, we saw a large fallen tree that made a bridge over a dried riverbed. We decided to rest, climb around on it, and take some pictures. After about 10 minutes, we resumed hiking. We continued for a short distance until she heard a rustle in the trees behind us. We stopped, mildly spooked by the size of whatever had made that noise, but continued on briefly before she decided she was done and wanted to head back. It was twilight now, so I agreed, and we turned around to head back to the car. When we made it back to the fallen tree, my shoe had come untied, so I used the trunk to fix my laces. I looked behind us for the first time during the hike, which was uncharacteristic of me, but I was having fun, so I wasn't paranoid. I saw a person dressed entirely in black with a hood on, walking a significant distance behind us at a slow, even pace. It wasn't necessarily alarming. So what if they were wearing black with a hood? I wear black most of the time, and it was cold out. Still, this triggered me to be more alert, and I informed my girlfriend about the person's presence. It was dusk by now. We continued at a faster pace through a winding section of the trail, and I lost sight of the person. When we came around the final bend of the section, I figured they were far behind us, and that there was nothing to worry about. Sooner than expected, the person reappeared behind us, but this time, they were much closer, probably only about 50 feet away compared to 100 feet before. Since we had increased our pace, this alarmed us. We briskly walked around another bend, and as soon as we were out of sight, we started running. It seemed like a natural reaction for both of us, as we just started sprinting without saying a word. We were nearing the trailhead, with only the hills left to navigate. We paused for a moment to catch our breath, and I looked back again. I saw the person halt their sprint as soon as they noticed me looking back, as if they were trying to maintain the illusion of merely walking. At this point, I shouted, "Go!" and we sprinted down the hill. The remaining light struggled to filter through the dense trees around us, and the steep hill was challenging to run down without a clear path. We stumbled down, almost falling several times, slamming our feet on rocks and loose brush. But we didn't fall, and we didn't look behind us. We made it to the bottom, but still had to climb the initial hill before we could reach the car. We persevered, made it up the incline, and finally reached our vehicle. I briefly breathed a sigh of relief as I started the car, my heart pounding and adrenaline racing. As I reversed onto the road, the person emerged at the trailhead, apparently breathing heavily. We finally got a good look at him. His hood had fallen off, exposing his pale complexion and lifeless eyes, illuminated by a single lantern at the start of the trail. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too dark to make out what it was, and I wasn't interested in sticking around to find out. I shifted into drive and accelerated as fast as my car could go, leaving him behind in the dust on the empty roadside.